So I want to start out by introducing myself and the Labour Heritage Centre and thanking you all today. So my name is Bailey Garden. I'm the project manager here at the Labour Heritage Centre. And as I mentioned, we have a couple of staff, but the Labour Heritage Centre is a nonprofit organization which relies largely on volunteers to get a lot of our work done. And so actually a number of our volunteers are also in the session today. Hello to everyone who's here. They're really what keeps the Labour Heritage Centre going. So this is an we have a number of projects and partnerships that we do to educate people on Labour history. This is an extension of our walking tour project. Some of you might have attended some of our walking tours. We usually are hosting public walking tours this time of year in Vancouver, but obviously due to physical distancing protocols, we've had to delay the start of that season. And we do hope to be able to resume in-person walking tours sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, we've given some thought to different ways that we can reach people, and this is one of them. And depending on how it turns out, we may even be able to continue doing events like this in the future to reach a wider base. I can see that there's people tuning in from different areas of BC, but also different areas of Canada, and that's really neat to see. So this allows us to reach a little bit of a wider base than we usually would. So just to, again, go back to the format that we're using here, this is a Zoom meeting format, which is a little bit different than a webinar in that I can see all of you that are here. If you have your camera on, I can actually see you. Otherwise, I just see your little icon. But that also means that when we have a chance, you'll be able to questions. In the meantime, like I said, use the chat feature. If you're a little bit more comfortable with Zoom, there's some other features that you can try using. You can raise your hand and that will show me that you have a question, and you can just leave that on and I'll be able to address it. Another option is that you can react to things with little applause and things like that. So feel free to play with those features if you feel comfortable and let me know that I'm doing an okay job. But without further ado, I'd like to get started here. And I want to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from the Labour Heritage Centre office in South Burnaby, which is on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We acknowledge this not just out of rote routine, but because we think it's important to acknowledge that the Labour movement rather has played a part in the marginalization of Indigenous people over the years. And so to work towards reconciliation, we think it's important to acknowledge that. The tour, most of the locations in the beginning are going to focus on the same territories, but obviously the trek spanned across Western Canada. And so I want to acknowledge that it crossed through both treated and untreated territories on that way. So give some thought to whose territory you are on right now. And we encourage you to educate yourself on that. So a little bit more about the Labour Heritage Centre. You can find us online. I imagine most of you are signed up to our newsletter or on our social media pages, which might have been how you heard about this. But if you're not, please do. It's the best way to keep in touch in terms of what we're doing at any given time, and you'll be able to hear if we're having any more events like this. So the On to Ottawa Trek, here we are 85 years since the trek started in Vancouver. And as someone in the building trades pointed out, what a difference and what an example of the present meeting the past with this event. We are all sitting comfortably in our homes or offices, tuning in online, and it's a far cry from crowding ourselves into boxcars. But this is a really interesting way to kind of reflect on that history. So to talk about the On to Ottawa Trek, we need to talk about the economic background of this situation and what people were experiencing in the days and months leading up to it. So of course, we are all familiar with the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1939, Canada suffered the longest and deepest economic depression in its history. The economic crisis was ushered in, of course, by the Wall Street market crash in 1929, and hundreds of companies, large and small, went bankrupt and closed their doors. Thousands of people who speculated in the stock market lost their savings overnight, and of course, thousands lost their jobs. Official figures placed unemployment at around 26.5%, but labor economists placed it around 40%. These once busy industrial sites were quiet as graveyards. For those still working, wages were cut anywhere between 10 to 15% a year, and coal mines only worked 1 day a week. At first, there was no welfare for those who lost their jobs, and among those hardest hit in this situation were the youth. Not wishing to be a burden upon their parents, they often left home and traveled by freight, searching from coast to coast for work, but there were no jobs to be had, of course. And so they arrived here in Vancouver, and that's where we're going to start our tour today. Vancouver has better weather than most of Canada, and because of that, we tend to have a large congregation of folks here. That was the case in the time of the Great Depression, and we still find that to be true today. And during the Great Depression, the First United Church, located at 424 Gore Street in Vancouver, offered some rare help to the unemployed and destitute. It was guided by an outspoken minister named Reverend Andrew Rodden, and the church fed around 800 to 1,200 unemployed men a day in the early 1930s. First United Church's most famous work was among the unemployed in the jungles, and these were makeshift camps located in empty parts of the city, including the dump, where Rodden would visit to preach and hand out food. These campsites also became important organizing locations for the radical left, especially communist front groups like the National Unemployed Workers Association. So life in the jungles than life in the relief camps. In 1931, the BC government established relief camps for single and unemployed men. In these work camps, they were usually located in the wilderness, far away from settled areas, and young men were employed at building roads, airports, military bases, and parks. Chances are there is a relief project somewhere near you. At first, the pay was $2 a day. But next, the camps in BC were operated jointly by the federal and provincial governments, and wages were reduced to $7.50 a month. In 1933, the Department of Defense took over the camps and reduced the pay to 20 cents a day plus meals, a bed, and some work clothes. The men worked 8 hours a day with a 44-hour work week. And of course, the real purpose of these camps was to hide the men away in faraway areas where they tended to make trouble for the authorities. This isolation and dehumanizing conditions actually created an ideal situation for organizing. Workers were desperate, and they had the time and the contact to figure out how to take action. So it wasn't long before these protest strikes began to develop. Relief camp workers in BC formed the Relief Camp Workers Union, and you saw a little banner there in the image here, which was a direct charter of the Workers' Unity League. The Relief Camp Workers Union was formed in July 1933 under the direction of Arthur Slim Evans, a skilled carpenter, miner, and communist labor organizer. The RCWU demand for work and wages spread quickly through the camps. Through 1934, the RCWU grew into a strong and disciplined democratic organization. They focused the hopes and energy of the unemployed, but all of their demands were consistently turned down by the Department of National Defense. The union was banned in the camps, and any man found carrying a union card or union literature, like the BC Relief Camp Worker newspaper here, was immediately fired and blacklisted. Many were jailed. So, what to do but go on strike? In December 1934, between 1,200 to 1,500 relief camp workers declared a general strike. The Department of National Defense retaliated by evicting over 1,000 men from the camps, and these evicted men made their way to Vancouver, joining other camp workers who had previously been blacklisted. This, of course, just made an even larger crowd to congregate, and even more kind of desperate folks gathering in one space. So in April of 1935, the union went on strike again. This time, nearly 2,000 filled the streets of Vancouver, shouting, "Work and wages, and when do we eat?" They demanded real work and pay, better food, clothing, shelter, and an end to military discipline. They were also trying to negotiate an unemployment insurance scheme and observance of workers' compensation laws. So they demonstrated, paraded, held picnics and public meetings, and they raised money with tin canning on tag days. They were determined never to go back to what they called the slave camps. So another unique tactic that was used here in Vancouver is what became known as a snake dance or a snake parade. And these became a common sight. They would weave their way through the streets, single file, and it was an effective tactic of shutting down traffic and drawing attention to the cause. One of these impromptu snake dances through the Hudson's Bay store in downtown Vancouver on April 23rd, 1935, resulted in a reading of the Riot Act in Victory Square. We are lucky to have a handwritten account of these events, which was actually found in the BC Labour Heritage Centre's archive files. Irene Chapman, who you can see here, recollected her time as a 26-year-old clerk at the Hudson's Bay, and she shows the widespread public support of the relief camp strikers in Vancouver. So I'm going to read from her handwritten account of this event. It says, 1935, I was 26 years old. Mayor McGeer reads the Riot Act. And she notes this was uncle to the present Pat McGeer, who is a long-serving Social Credit Party cabinet minister in BC. So it reads, while reading this, a flood of memories came back. I was there in the Hudson's Bay Company when the men marched through. We knew they were coming. Each department in the store had been warned. I remember getting that feeling of excitement and yet apprehension. How would they act? Would there be violence? We all hoped not. Our manager, we were the ladies in children's shoes, had us all line up. Approximately 6 men, 4 women at the front, just behind the showcases from the top, of which we had cleared all merchandise. I think the idea of us being up front was to try and stop them from coming into the main part of the department. After all, we didn't want things disarrayed, did we? We were on the main floor next to the revolving doors, which led to Granville Street. Therefore, our cases were last in line before you left the store in that direction. I was in charge of children's shoes, and so up in the corner. So vividly, I remember. They came 2, 3, 4 abreast, not a word. They all looked so tired, gray, no expression on their faces, sullen if anything, all very orderly. All of a sudden, an onrush. We heard later the police had arrived and were trying to drive them out. That is when the action started. Some of the men carried caps in their hand and inside a rock. Looking me straight in the eye, one brought his hand down hard, and smash went the top of the showcase. Another lifted his booted foot, and the curved glass on the end case shattered. I knew how they felt, and I thought, good for you. We later heard from the girls in different departments at the front of the store that our supervisor, Mr. Port, had come out of his office on the mezzanine floor and ordered the police out of his store. The men then left in an orderly manner. Mr. Port was a beautiful person, tall, gray-haired, and a person any one of us could talk to at any time. I think we were all in sympathy with the men. After all, we'd all had our wages cut. I was getting $20 a week as a section head, the same as men in the department who in most cases were married with children, and then we were cut to $18 a week. So you see, we were in sympathy with them, as we didn't know about what we would be joining the unemployed. We were asked later, could we identify anyone? Well, no, they all looked alike, didn't they? So I think that's a great kind of example of how much support schools had. And she finishes the letter by saying, by the way, it took 6 months for the curved glass to come from Italy to replace the broken one. Too bad. So this took place at the Hudson's Bay, which is still located on the corner of Granville and Georgia. And I'm going to try my hand at showing you that right now. Just one moment. There's going to be a bit of a delay as it comes up on your screens. But you can see, if you haven't seen it before, the Hudson's Bay Company here in Vancouver at the corner of Georgia and Granville. And it was this corner that she was describing working at in the children's and shoes area. So you can imagine the scene of these marchers snake dancing their way down the street and into the Hudson's Bay. And as the police cracked down and several were arrested, they headed out the doors here and down Georgia Street, if you can see my cursor just moving, towards Victory Square, where many police were waiting for them. And this is where our infamous interaction came with the mayor. So you can see here with this little arrow, that's Mayor McGeer reading the Riot Act at Victory Square to these protesters. So this was widely mocked. By this point, it was far from a riot. Everyone was very orderly as they made their way down Georgia Street, and a delegation was invited to meet with the mayor prior to the reading, but it went nowhere. This was mocked a week later in the May Day parade, which was actually the largest in the city's history up until that point, where people marched along Hastings Street. You can see signs here saying, "Are we going back to camp?" No. And marchers in this parade pulled along a wagon with an effigy of Mr. McGeer, dressed as a German soldier labeled "In Hitler's Footsteps." So Mother's Day was even better in terms of support for the strikers. The Mothers' Council, which was a left-wing, broad-based women's group, led a large march to Stanley Park. There, they formed a giant heart around the Young Relief Camp workers, demanding the abolishment of the camps while enjoying a picnic in the park. "Bring a hamper and adopt one of our boys," the mothers were urged, and many obliged. Others invited the strikers to their homes for a meal that night. But despite the waves of public sympathy, there was still no sign of relief from the city or Ottawa. Strikers knew they needed to try something radical. So what I'm about to show you is a clip from a video titled "On to Ottawa." And this was produced by the Ottawa Historical Society and the Women's Labor History Project in 1992. It was directed by Sarah Diamond. It's available on the BC Labour Heritage Centre website, and it's 1 hour and it's full length. This video is based upon a play that was written by Tom Hawkins, someone who most of you are probably familiar with. And it was originally written around Expo 86. This play drew on oral history from Trek participants themselves and others that were involved. And it features his band, along with Trek participants Robert Bobby Jackson, Ray Wainwright, and Jean Evans Shields, who was the daughter of Trek leader Arthur Slim Evans. It features some great archival footage, as well as a little bit of stock footage and photos, but they're going to describe this next event, which took place on May 18th, 1935.
At our morning meeting, Rodney Liversedge from the Strategy Committee proposed that we suspend our normal agenda. The vote was in favor. He then proposed that the divisions do whatever assigned to them to do. The vote was again unanimous. The air was electric. We all knew that something was about to happen.
The plan was for Division 1 to march to Spencer's store, now the Sears Center. Give the impression that we were going to enter the store, to keep marching around the store chanting, "When do we eat? When do we eat?" drawing as much attention as possible. 10 minutes later, Division 2 was to march around the Woodward store and commence a similar diversion.
Meanwhile, back at Division 3, my division, events were being watched very closely. As soon as we got word that the police had been successfully diverted, we marched quick time to the museum, now the Carnegie Center on Main and Hastings, entered the building, instructed the staff to leave, and barricaded ourselves in. The other two divisions joined forces and commenced to stake parade up Hastings towards us. Public support was phenomenal. They stood guard along with Divisions 1 and 2, shouting their support and sending up food and tobacco with wicker baskets to the third floor.
You could bet the wires were really humming that day. Telephones was ringing all over town. But the busiest one was the mayor's office. What could he do? By the time our delegation reached him, he was ready to concede 2 days relief and safe conduct from the museum. It was a victory, no doubt about it. We'd finally forced old Jeremiah Jesus McGeer to cough up some relief. What's more, everything had worked out just as planned, not a hitch. We left the museum without a trace of damage, and the crowd cheered as we marched, singing, "Hold the Fort."
Look
So hopefully everyone was able to see that, and I apologize that the quality is not the greatest, being from 1992, but it's a fantastic film. Yes, you can view that 1 hour play online. Someone asked in the chat. You can find it on our website on the On to Ottawa section, which I will be linking at the end here as well. So this occupation of the Carnegie Library happened on a site which still exists to this day, so we can visit it through the power of Google Maps. But as the video said, this relief was short-lived. It only lasted 2 days, and 2 days isn't a very long time when you're hungry. So they knew that they had to do something different. So here is the Carnegie Public Library. As you can see, it's right on the corner of Main and Hastings, so right on the border of historic Chinatown. It is no longer a library. It's now a center that services the low-income community which surrounds here. But you can also see that there are a lot of, sorry if you're getting a little bit seasick from my turning the camera here, but you can see there are a lot of historic buildings still on Hastings Street. And you can almost kind of see the transition where it goes more into West Vancouver, downtown Vancouver, and you can see a lot more glass and newer buildings here. Once again, this is a site that's highlighted on our regular walking tours when we are hosting them in person. I encourage everyone to also check out our BC Labour History Walking Tour app if you want to learn more about the Carnegie Centre or about First United Church. You can download our app on any device, so an Apple device that you might have or an Android device. You can just look it up in the App Store. It's titled BC Labour History Walking Tours, and you can find a number of our routes on there if you're interested in learning more. So, as I said, 2 days doesn't last a long time. Both the mayor and business leaders had condemned the strike at this point as a communist conspiracy. And though it is true that the communists had provided an education in organizing and mobilizing tactics, the RCWU was not an insurrection. It was a movement that BC hadn't seen before. And in the words of their leader, Slim Evans, you can't go on marching and singing and begging with tin cans. You've got to do something new. So 2 weeks later, a mass meeting was called to discuss the future of the strike, which was beginning to thin in ranks, morale, and support. But out of this necessity arose a brilliant new tactic. The proposal was that all the strikers would go to Ottawa in an organized body via freight trains and place their case directly before the Prime Minister. And as Evans said, if applause could do it, they would have taken the roof off that building. An On to Ottawa steering committee was elected with Art Evans as the leader. George Black was his second in command, and Jack Cosgrove was appointed Trek Marshal. The Vancouver media was notified, and wires were sent to the Labour press throughout Canada. And before the truckers left Vancouver, a reporter named James Kingsbury of the Toronto Star actually approached the leaders and showed them his credentials and asked to join the march. When asked what kind of reporter he was, he said, "A reporter, period. A reporter who reports what he sees without any attempt to slant the news one way or another." He was accepted and allowed to ride along on the trek, and his sympathetic reports from the rails were front page news for the time that he was traveling with them. Strikers held one more unauthorized tag day on June 2nd and a public picnic the following day. More than 30,000 leaflets were distributed, urging citizens to gather in support of the trek that evening at the train tracks. So they may have been unemployed, but at this point, it's safe to say that the strikers were far from unorganized. The truckers left Vancouver just after 10 p.m. on June 3rd, 1935, with hundreds of Vancouverites gathering to see them off. They sang labor songs and climbed up the iron ladders with CPR boxcars and seated themselves as best as they could on the top for the long ride to Kamloops. More than 800 left on the first train, another 200 on a later CNR freight, and another 350 followed the next morning. They had no blankets and only light clothing, very quickly went numb to the cold. But luckily at Coquitlam, the provincial police opened some empty boxcars, which people were able to pile in like sardines. And so the trek was on. So we're able to, thanks to having a virtual tour, see the location where the trek left from. Usually this is a little bit away for us on our walking tours and a little inaccessible. So we usually make reference to the train tracks from where we can view them in downtown Vancouver. But this, apologies that the left side of the screen hasn't loaded in here, but this is at the foot of Gore Street in Vancouver. That was the port just to the left that we turned away from. But you can see these are the tracks where folks were waiting to climb aboard that night, June 3rd, 85 years ago. Just over here where I'm panning to, you can see this is called the Main Street Overpass. And there's actually a plaque installed here in honor of the fact that this is where the On to Ottawa trek began. And I'll show you a photo of that later on in our tour. So, on to Ottawa, on we go. A lot of people might ask whether there were women on the trek or other minorities. And this photo, which was published about a week after the trek began, gives us a little bit of an answer to that. It was titled Sisters with Trek at the Coast, and it shows the O'Brien sisters, quote, dressed in their mannish best with the trekkers in Vancouver. But it seems that this was little more than a photo op. The caption follows up, reports now are that there are no women with the trekkers. And this was not for women's lack of want to join, as we will see later in the tour. But race and nationalities of the trekkers were also discussed in the media. In addition to declaring the lot as communists, critics of the trek had also claimed that it was comprised of hoodlums and foreigners. Unfortunately, in an attempt to gain legitimacy and respect with the public, supporters would often give in to these tropes in their defense. For example, one said, the majority of them, as you can see, are clean-cut Irish boys, predominantly of Anglo-Saxon stock. There are quite a few Irish. And this does seem to be a more accurate account of the demographics, but it shows how these identities were weaponized in an attempt to marginalize and silence the voices of the trekkers. So their first stop was in Kamloops, British Columbia. After a freezing cold ride on top of the boxcars, they arrived the next day stiff, sore, tired, and hungry. So in two groups, they marched in orderly fashion to camp quarters that had been arranged for them in Riverside Park, but they found that the preparations had been inadequate. They quickly took matters into their own hands, canvassed citizens and businesses, and soon there was enough food for all. So after a quick wash in the cold North Thompson River, they bedded down here in, Riverside Park in Kamloops, in amongst the trees here. Some were able to sleep on the boxcars, but they had their late meal and settled in here. In amongst the trekkers were also cats and dogs along for entertainment and companionship. So you can imagine it would have been quite the crowd here in Kamloops. So they stayed for 2 days in Kamloops while they waited for the second contingent to catch up. And according to Kamloops Police Chief Charles Anderson, the men gave no trouble while they were in town and were very orderly. And we'll find that this was the report heard about the trekkers as they carried on throughout Western Canada. So this is just a news article on the trekkers having an unauthorized tag day while they were in Kamloops, as many of their tag days were along the trek. And on they went to Golden, BC. So this is about the halfway point. I'm just going to take a quick look at our chat here to see if I've missed any questions, but it looks like we're doing a great job. Everyone give me a thumbs up if we're sticking with it here. Great, fantastic. All right, so on to Golden we go. And between Kamloops and Golden, the boys on the boxcars had to endure the trip through the Connaught Tunnel under the Rogers Pass. It was more than 8 long underground kilometers, a slow, suffocating trip with the men breathing in dirty fumes, covering their mouths and noses with handkerchiefs and rags where they could. Evans had gone ahead to Golden, and luckily he had arranged a happy reception for them when they arrived on June 6th. Much better than the conditions they came to in Kamloops. This time, the lodging was at the Auto Park, and this is now the home of the Golden Municipal Campground. So we can take a visit here again, a place that I'd love to be here right now, as I think many of us would be. What a sight the trekkers were greeted by as they would have marched down to the river in Golden here. I just do a bit of a slow pan. You can see folks were out here camping at the time that these images were taken. A little bit more lush accommodations than the trekkers would have had. But what waited for them here has become legendary. They were exhausted and cold, and they climbed off the train and marched down here to find a massive bathtub suspended over a fire with other wash tubs nearby. A gray-haired woman called out, "Good morning, boys," as she stirred the best beef stew that any of the trekkers could recall eating. And we are lucky enough to have an image of this moment from the Golden Museum and Archives. And I should mention, actually, that the photos that we've been seeing, if they're not otherwise labeled, are part of the Ottawa Historical Society. But this one is from the Golden Museum and Archives. You can see here, this is Mrs. Sorley of Golden, BC, who was the recipient of Trek organizer Arthur Evans' telegram asking to prepare food for 1,000 men when the group arrived in town. And that's Arthur himself stirring that massive wash tub. Sorley was a Communist Party and Workers' Unity League organizer, and so she canvassed farms for miles around to find sufficient food for the boys when they arrived. Long tables were set up filled with eggs and bread from the local farms. And so they had a great time. You can see the huge lineup here of trekkers waiting for food. 2 trekkers who had been drunk that day were expelled from their ranks, and one turned out to be an agent of the police. Slim Evans was needed back in Vancouver at this point by the Workers' Unity League, so his second-in-command, George Black, took over from here. So with full bellies and with full hearts, they were gone from Golden. At Field, 2 RCMP officers informed the trekkers about the perils of Spiral Tunnel. Though the riders had their dampened handkerchiefs and towels over their mouths and noses, the dark and noisy ride was terrifying and dangerous. As the train emerged from the second corkscrew tunnel, their faces were as grimy as their clothes, and first aid squads had to attend to many of the trekkers who had become overcome by the fumes. And at the Alberta border, as they crossed, James Kingsbury reported that 24 British Columbia Provincial Police gave the boys a big cheer and a wave of their hands as the train passed by the boundary. So on to Calgary, my hometown. And the trekkers were excited as they were picking up steam here. In they marched, chanting, "We want food," blocking traffic as they went. Large numbers of Calgarians shouted encouragement and dropped cigarette packs from the office windows. But so well ordered were the strikers that not one broke ranks, said a later report. The city council agreed that the trekkers could be housed on the cement floor in the basement of the grandstand at the exhibition grounds. If anyone is familiar with the Calgary Stampede, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But the trekkers needed more than a place to sleep. They were without funds and without food. So, of course, more militant action was needed. When the Alberta Relief Commission refused to grant them meal tickets, they picketed and surrounded the office until the relief was provided. The siege, which the press described as a hostage-taking, had lasted for 3.5 hours and produced temporary assistance of 15-cent meal vouchers for the trekkers. So returning to the idea of female trekkers, this article describes a mass meeting that was held while they were in Calgary, in which 2 divisions of unemployed women asked to join the Trek. They were voted down nearly unanimously, which solidified the Trek, unfortunately, as an exclusive boys' club. But 150 new recruits arrived from Edmonton, among them Phil Klein, father of former Alberta Premier Ralph Klein. Locals hosted picnics and flooded them with food and clothing. One leader remarked that they were seriously considering asking the CPR to provide an empty boxcar to transport the hundreds of loaves of bread that they had donated to them. Once again, not a single complaint was received regarding the strikers. That Sunday afternoon, labor organizations held a picnic on St. George's Island, the current site of the Calgary Zoo, with an orchestra and a concert. Citizens brought an evening meal, and while the men marched to the island, supposedly, someone tried to strike up a rendition of the Internationale, but this was promptly squelched by the younger element who said they were determined to keep the Red faction out of the picture. Hundreds of Calgarians gathered to say goodbye to the trek as they left. And as you can see in this article, they had been offered $200 to pass up their next stop, Medicine Hat, along the way. But this only doubled their determination to stop and raise awareness of the cause as they did. They only stopped for 24 hours in Medicine Hat, and they stayed at Athletic Park while they were there, with cooking facilities and food provided by the authorities. But Medicine Hat was significant because it was here that Evans joined them once again. So he had come all the way from Vancouver by freight train, pulling in at 2 a.m. Trek leader Steve Brody, who actually went on to lead the post office sit-down strike in Vancouver a few years later, gave this account of Evans' arrival in Medicine Hat. I was tending night fires with a group and smoking and drinking coffee when out of the shadows at the entrance came a man. Somebody looked up and said, "Well, here's Arthur." He had pulled on a pair of overalls over his suit. His face was black with soot and his eyes were red from cinders and tiredness. He looked at me and said, "Steve, for God's sake, give me a cup of coffee, please." Then he told me the story. Evans had managed to maneuver his way onto the tender of a train, which he had been riding as a passenger, after noticing two policemen were aboard with him. He rode the rest of the way to Medicine Hat on the outside. So on they went from Medicine Hat, and 3 cheers for Swift Current voices rang out as trekkers were welcomed in yet another town along the way. This time they only stopped for a meal, which was donated by the city. And although they had suffered unimaginable conditions up until this point, tragedy and humor rode the rails, according to the profile of one young man who rode from Calgary to Swift Current with no shoes. It's a bit of a humorous article amongst some more serious things. So their next stop was in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and it was here that they learned that the Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett, had no intention of allowing them to reach Ottawa. At a mass meeting of 3,000 people, the trekkers discussed the plans to end the protest, and he actually planned to end it before it got to Winnipeg, a known labor hotbed, home of the 1919 general strike. They wouldn't be allowed any further than their next stop in Regina, Saskatchewan. But the mood was defiant. "If they attack us, we're not going to lie down and take it," said 24-year-old Matt Young, and their determination urged their departure on the very next train. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police began their mobilization. So just after dawn, on June 14th, 1935, a train full of trekkers arrived in Regina, Saskatchewan. On board were over 1,000 strikers, 1 undercover Mountie, and a 2nd secret operative with the CPR. As the strikers stepped off the train and lined up with military precision, it was reported there was cheering and singing and men wearing shirts plastered with signs, "On to Ottawa," and "Cheer the boys on their way." The public was solidly on the side of the trekkers. Over 6,000 citizens in this small city gave them an enthusiastic welcome at a meeting that day. The speakers included the National Secretary of the CCF Party, church and trade union leaders, and of course, Arthur Evans. Despite opposition from Saskatchewan's Premier, Jimmy Gardiner, the RCMP moved hundreds of reinforcements into the city from other provinces. The police were ordered to prepare revolvers, gas grenades, spare batons, and handcuffs. Railway police were ordered to cooperate with the RCMP and ban the trek as trespassers. Further orders were given to bar all exits in and out of Regina. The city was placed under police siege. But the strike committee was defiant. The plan was to carry on to Winnipeg by June 17th, as you can see in this handbill, which was distributed to citizens, asking for their support. Strikers paraded through the streets, with leaders holding meetings in the basement of the Hotel Saskatchewan. They were joined by hundreds more relief camp workers. Evans and a delegation of strikers met several times with the Saskatchewan Premier Gardiner, who was eager to get the trek out of his province without any trouble. But as a delaying tactic, the federal government sent 2 cabinet ministers to Regina to meet with the trekkers. The ministers proposed that the trekkers send a delegation to Ottawa to meet directly with Prime Minister Bennett. Of course, the trekkers knew that this was a trap. They were under no illusions, and they wanted to reach some sort of resolution. They also realized that a refusal to meet with Bennett would be used as a weapon against them. Hours of heated debate came at a meeting, but it led to a unanimous vote. An 8-person delegation would go, which you can see here, provided the government paid their expenses, along with lodging and 3 restaurant meals a day for the trekkers remaining in Regina. And this time, the men rode the train first class on their way to Ottawa. That meeting was one of the most dramatic in all of the drama-filled labor struggles of the 1930s. Bennett, accompanied by some of his cabinet ministers, did most of the talking. The meeting lasted over an hour. Members of the delegation were not offered seats. Bennett wanted to know where they were born, hoping no doubt to find a foreigner in their ranks. Evans presented the case for the trekkers, being constantly interrupted by the Prime Minister. The trekkers noted a curtain that did not quite reach the floor, which seemed to reveal the boots of an RCMP guard. They angrily began to interrupt the Prime Minister in return. Bennett called Evans an embezzler. Evans lost his temper and retorted, "You're a liar," a comment that made headlines across the country. More insults were thrown, and the bitter meeting ended with no agreement. So they returned to Regina June 26th to find the government had broken its promise of meals and had 75 Mounties shipped in from Vancouver, fresh from the Battle of Ballantine crackdown on June 18th, only less than a week earlier. Any citizen found assisting the strikers would now be subject to arrest. A June 29th picnic drew a sparse crowd, and sensing no way out, Evans started to negotiate with Premier Gardner, who was furious with the RCMP and with the Prime Minister. In an effort to avoid any trouble, the trekkers now made a major compromise. They agreed to call off the protest, provided that the government would send them back to Vancouver and then to their respective camps or homes. The trekkers also asked assurance that there would be no arrests. The one thing that they rejected was being sent to a federal holding camp north of Regina, calling it a concentration camp. On July 1st, Evans and other Trek leaders spent the whole day meeting with the head of the RCMP, a representative of the federal government, and the Premier of Saskatchewan. But these meetings got nowhere. The head of the RCMP told them that if they refused to go to the special camp that had been prepared for them, they would have to face the consequences. Which leads us here. So this is a seemingly unhistoric site. But if we look a little bit closer here, as I zoom in, we are at the location of the Regina Police Headquarters. And you can see there is a green plaque affixed to the front of the headquarters, marking this as a provincial historic site. If we carry down this street, you can see there are some original buildings remaining. Just give it a second to catch up with me here. So turning here, you can see there is a historic commercial block which is still standing. There is the number 1 fire hall, and the Municipal Justice Building is in the background. And then to our left, once again, is the police headquarters, which we were just standing outside of. So these historic buildings framed what was, in 1935, Regina's historic Market Square, now the current site of the Regina Police Service headquarters. No one thought much about a meeting being held here that night. In fact, only about 300 of the crowd that night were trekkers. So I'm going to show you one more clip from the On to Ottawa video that we viewed earlier. Once again, it's based on a play. And this is going to allow the trekkers to explain what happened on July 3rd, 1935.
It was Dominion Day, July the 1st, 1935. An evening meeting was called to hear a report from our returned delegates. About 3,000 townspeople attended. Most of the trekkers, having already heard the report, were off at a local baseball game.
Large moving vans, innocently parked around the square, burst open at the shrill of a whistle. Out poured the Mounties, each armed with clubs as big as baseball bats. At the same time, the city police came charging out of their station. They waded into the crowd like wild men, clubbing defenseless citizens to the ground as they went. The leaders of the trek were arrested, the police riot was on, and the On to Ottawa trek was off. The battle lasted until 2 o'clock in the morning. Hundreds were seriously wounded. Some were crippled for life. If the police had wanted to, they could have arrested the truck leaders that afternoon at 5 p.m. in Premier Gardner's office. The whole idea had been to destroy our organization.
This tragic event in BC and Canadian labor history became known as the Regina Riot. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book that we produced a few years ago titled On the Line, A History of the BC Labor Movement by author Rod Mickleborough, who is in the session today. Give him a virtual wave. But it's a great description of what we just saw in that video, as well as what happened afterwards. So at 8:17 p.m., as a modest crowd of 1,500 listened to the rally's first speaker, two loud blasts from a police whistle split the early evening air. Within seconds, police were charging through the terrified crowd, clearing a path to the speaker's platform by knocking over anyone in their way with truncheons. Willis Chapala called the sudden whistle and police charge the most fearful moment of my life. As people desperately took flight to escape the riot sticks, Evans and co-leader George Black were quickly collared and taken to jail. After a brief lull, the fracas turned into a riot. The unprovoked attack on a peaceful gathering released an outpouring of bottled-up rage from the trekkers and equally angered citizens. Rocks, bricks, and other projectiles rained down on police. A few attacked isolated officers with clubs and other weapons. Plainclothes City Detective Charles Miller was struck and killed, his assailants never identified. The battle continued in Regina's darkened downtown streets. Police advanced with tear gas, billy clubs, gunfire, and fierce charges on horseback. Nick Shack, an unemployed farmhand, received several blows to the head. He died in hospital 3 months later. Despite their numbers and firepower advantage, police did not manage to secure an edgy calm until 11 p.m. The city's two hospitals treated more than 100 victims, including some police, and at least a dozen patients with gunshot wounds. The next morning, outraged by the RCMP onslaught, Premier Gardner wrestled control of the situation from police and from the federal government by arranging the strikers' orderly departure. After their frustrating 3-week stay in Regina, trekkers began to register for the trip home. All told, 1,358 men accepted the offer to leave, this time inside the trains and on the cushions. 2/3 were from British Columbia, half from Vancouver. Although falling 2,600 kilometers short of its goal, the On to Ottawa trek, hatched in Vancouver, is remembered today as one of the country's most inspiring protests. 66 years later, at the age of 92, trekker Harry Lindsley told an interviewer, "All we ever wanted was work and wages." So here we are on the 85th anniversary, and it's important to reflect on what happened after the trek, because this was far from the end. On the day the Star published its final editorial on the riot, the paper also printed portions of a July 4th interview with Jimmy Gardner, a premier who was still fuming over the federal government's intervention in his province. After Gardner had explained how he considered the strikers fine chaps, he admitted that during the riot, some of the trekkers actually policed the city. "What do you mean by that amazing statement, Mr. Premier?" asked reporter Griffin. "I meant that strikers took over the protection of citizens and property. They established pickets between the Parliament buildings and the zone of strife, for example, cars warning them of the trouble. One of our own cars was stopped at the corner of Hamilton and 11th or 12th, and the occupants advised that they better not go on. Why not, was the natural question. We won't hurt you, but the police may, was the answer, said Premier Gardner. The final comment in the same editorial reflected on the funeral march for the fallen detective, held 3 hours after the trekkers left Regina. And you can see an image of their last trek nursing their injuries and playing their accordion as they make their way to the train. It read, "There was irony in the march of the mourning police. For this man need not have died. The riot need not have happened. The strikers who moved out would have moved out 4 days earlier if their suggestions of last Monday had been accepted, as they were finally accepted. But unfortunately, Detective Miller died. That was a tragedy that might never have occurred." So the trek was disbanded following the terms of the agreement. A federal inquiry found that the tragic events of Dominion Day in 1935 were caused by revolutionaries, not by the RCMP. The people of Canada threw out Bennett's Conservatives in that year's general election, and the relief camps were shut down. The seeds were sown for a new welfare system, including unemployment insurance. They compelled the government to repeal the notorious Section 98 of the Criminal Code, which the leaders had been charged under, which had been used to suppress political opposition and labor militancy. The campaign for the release of those arrested went on until the middle of 1936. Many trekkers who were radicalized by the Depression volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War 2 years later in Canada's Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. Two who died, Peter Nielsen and Patty O'Neill, had been members of the Ottawa delegation. Others stayed in Canada to fight for progressive causes until the fight with the fascists in Europe called them to war for World War II. Arthur Slim Evans carried on organizing until his death in 1944, and trekkers like young Steve Brody led new protests for the unemployed, like the month-long 1938 post office occupation in Vancouver. But there have been lots of efforts to keep the trek alive. On the 50th anniversary of the trek, which that photo was also taken on, there were several events to commemorate the On to Ottawa trek. This was in 1985. So a gathering was held in Victory Square to mark the anniversary of the reading of the Riot Act, but this time Alderman Harry Rankin read a proclamation of goodwill to the unemployed from Mayor Mike Harcourt. A June 5th delegation of trekkers and trade union leaders left for Ottawa to complete the trek and actually had an audience with Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Trekkers and supporters established the On to Ottawa Historical Society in 1988, which has produced educational resources, including a slideshow and the On to Ottawa video, which we've referenced a couple times in today's tour. And they made presentations wherever an audience demanded. We have these resources and others on our website, including a video from the Society's 2002 website launch when they had their website. And that's where this content was all originally hosted. On June 6, 2010, the 75th anniversary of the trek was marked by the On to Ottawa Historical Society, apologies, I'm losing control of my tongue as we're reaching the end here, which partnered with the BC Fed, the Vancouver District Labour Council, and a number of other community groups to commemorate it. And once again, a delegation was sent off, this time with local members of the homeless community and housing advocates taking their demands for safe and secure housing to Ottawa. And that was someone who spoke there was Joey Hartman, our chair, and you can see a video of that event in Crab Park on our website. Another highlight of that event was the installation of a permanent historical marker on the Main Street overpass above the CPR rail yards. Unfortunately, the original plaque was stolen late last year in what is happening in a number of cities where people are experiencing these bronze plaques going missing. But luckily, we are happy to report that we have had a replacement installed just in time for the 85th anniversary. You can see the original plaque on our website. This is the new one, and the only thing that's changed. And the reason that that's changed is because in 2018, the On to Ottawa Historical Society merged with the BC Labour Heritage Society. We become the caretaker of their collection of photos, videos, and recordings, and their website is no longer active. The BCLHC has been commemorating the trek for years, as you can see in this plaque, which was installed outside the Vancouver Convention Centre, along with a number of others. And we also partnered with the Knowledge Network on a series of vignettes titled Working People, which you can find on our website. We also have DVDs available of the whole series of 30 vignettes, but one of them is on the On to Ottawa trek. You can now find everything related to the Society on our website, along with a list of additional resources on the trek, including books, articles, everything that you can imagine that's been written or done on the trek. And you can also find a lesson plan to accompany the vignette that I just mentioned for use in secondary schools if you or anyone you know is a teacher. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us today on the 85th anniversary of the On to Ottawa trek. At a time when we find ourselves in another period of unprecedented unemployment, economic, social, and political unrest. I don't know about you folks, but when I was reading or listening to this, a lot of it sounded so familiar to what's happening right now. And so I want to wrap up here. We're going to have an opportunity if there are questions at the end or if anyone has any comments they want to make. But I'm going to leave you with one final clip from On to Ottawa, which is a message from the trekkers themselves, keeping in mind that this was done in 1992, but these words ring in my opinion, even truer in 2020 than they did back then. So we'll take a look.
For the next 40 years, we all rode the economy the way we used to ride the freights in the dirty 30s. Up and down, over the straight, hot flowing prairies when times were good, holding on for dear life through the cold mountain passes when times were hard, never knowing what the next bend would bring or when the next boom or bust would end.
Unemployment insurance and health insurance were finally won. Welfare for the needy. Even unions grew with the good times.
Gradually, like a train picking up speed, things begin to change. Suddenly, I'm an angry young man again.
Hear, hear.
Massive unemployment is everywhere, and the unthinkable war is here. Food banks, evictions, bankruptcies, farm foreclosures are growing everywhere, and everywhere our youth is hit the hardest. For millions of unemployed Canadians, our slogan of work and wages is still as valid today as it was then. I want to say to the young people of Canada, there's no shame in being unemployed. It is not your fault. But if you don't fight back and organize, that would be a bloody shame.
Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in today. And I leave you with that message. So, taking a look here, if anyone is interested in sticking around for a discussion, please feel free, but you're also welcome to log out now at this point. So I see one of the comments I just want to highlight in case anyone missed it. We actually had a relative of George Black here in the group, which is so great. All sorts of different folks here that are much more involved with the trek than some might realize. Again, I mentioned our author, Rod Mickleborough, who has a whole chapter on to Ottawa in the book, is here, along with a number of other folks. David York, who has a great collection of on to Ottawa related goods and all sorts of different things. Someone's commenting there were a number of other trekkers who died in Spain, and you can see their names listed in the chat there. And that's a really important thing. I want to acknowledge, actually, there's a project to commemorate the MacPap vets, as they don't receive a lot of recognition from the government of Canada or anyone else, really. And so I encourage you to look it up in the fall. There's an opportunity where they ask the community to lay roses on the graves of vets that are in various communities. All right, well, so it looks like there's no particular questions, but I hope that everyone enjoyed today's event. Again, this was our first time trying a 100% online event. So if you have any feedback on ways that we can improve it or things that worked or didn't work, please let us know. We'd love to try and do this again sometime again as a way to reach a wider group of people on a wider audience. And we didn't have to wear masks, as someone said. Somebody has a question. I'm going to unmute them. One moment, please. Hi, Rod.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can all hear you now. So
how long did this amazing production take you?
It was put together in a little bit of short notice, more so than we'd like it to be, as the inspiration hit a little bit late when we realized that our idea for the virtual tour could go really well with a commemoration of the On to Ottawa, being that it's the 85th anniversary. So again, we do hope to do a number of other ones on this, on other topics, and maybe make them even more elaborate if we have some more time to work on them and get more creative with them.
You just sort of snapped your fingers and it happened?
You know how I do it, Rod. We make things work.
Wow, it was incredible. Great stuff.
All right. Thank you so much. Oh, so it looks like we have a US-based union activist in the crowd. This should have been recorded. This is the last piece that I'm hoping went well with the technical side of things. So I saw some people had to come and go throughout. As long as the recording worked out okay, we're going to have it up on either our YouTube and or our Facebook page very shortly. So you'll be able to rewatch it and share it with others from there. So without any further ado, I think we're going to wrap up today. But again, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for commemorating. We've had a huge turnout, and it's really great to see so many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces here.